Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Blackberry Jam Decaf Washed Anaerobic Processed Colombia from September Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario. And this coffee was featured in our May 2024 Coffee of the Month poll, where it finished second place in our YouTube poll. However, it took home first place on our Instagram poll. So we decided to make the Rainbow EA Decaf Natural Processed Colombia from S&W Craft Roasting our Coffee of the Month. But we also decided to purchase this one, giving us 2 decaf coffees to review and also an opportunity to compare and contrast them side by side. So we will see how this decaf turned out, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was interestingly our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So given my very strong lack of familiarity with decaf coffees, it was a little bit more tricky for me to tell. September did have this one listed as being on the light medium side of their spectrum, and I can say that the S&W one did feel perhaps slightly lighter. So I feel like that's a pretty good idea of where this decaf was. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression. And we did opt for the V60, and the cup was very strange in the sense that it did offer that fermenty taste that's very much expected of a lot of Wilton Benitez coffees. But interestingly enough, it didn't have the expected brightness or lingering aspect of those Wilton Benitez coffees to kind of back it up. And for those that have had a lot of Wilton Benitez coffees, you know that they can be pretty intense in terms of the long-lasting finish as well as the brightness. So having that fermenty aspect without the other aspects to kind of complement that was unique and strange in a certain sense. Outside of that, there is a berry forward aspect with a slightly fleeting sweetness. Interestingly though, it didn't offer too much of the decaf taste right off brew. It does more so as it cooled down, but it was an interesting start as there was immediately a lot more to take away from this decaf. Day 17 through the Chemex, and it was a pretty similar experience, with it essentially feeling like a more processed Colombian coffee without the lingering, lasting fermentiness and intensity to it. And even then, it still did have a very long-lasting taste, but not necessarily in the sense of that really strong funkiness, fermentiness that can be associated with Wilton Benitez's more processed coffees. Outside of that, there is some sugariness, but it does continue to offer a fair bit of that decaf-like taste as it does cool down, which is much more of the lingering finish that I'm referencing within this coffee. We move on to day 20 as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup was slightly better, as it was definitely best right off brew through this brew method, as it didn't necessarily have the same sort of intensity once it did cool down, but rather a little bit more tartness to the cup in general. And I can't quite recall what the notes that they had listed on here other than Blackberry Jam is, but I think that tartness could be associated with the blackberries, as blackberries, and say unripened blackberries, can be slightly tart in that sense. Still a bit of sugariness and the decaf-like aspect to it in the finish. We move on to day 23 as we opted for the V60 with lower temperatures and a more coarse grind. And that's a big thing because when it came to the Rainbow EA Decaf, that's where I found the most success from that coffee. And I was fully expecting that, given we'd had, I would say, relatively more positive results based off these first couple of impressions with this coffee, this sort of adjustment would do wonders for this one. However, that was certainly not the case, as there was a slight bit more clarity to it. However, it was a little less intense in terms of the fruit aspects, slightly better definition to listed strawberry, which I think is supposed to be a little bit more of a faint aspect within this coffee, but it does continue to offer the strong fruit aspects without the overbearing heaviness to it. The entire cup, interestingly, just felt significantly more toned down, which, given that this coffee already has a slightly toned down measure to what you would typically expect from a Wilton Benitez coffee, I had pretty mixed feelings on that result. So we tried it again on day 26 with the Chemex, and this was by far the most tame it had been. It's actually slightly off-putting, with a lot of the only notes coming through being the decaf taste and the slight fermentiness of those berry fruits. So outside of that, I wasn't getting the, we'll say, more sugary and sweet aspects of this coffee, so adjustments were definitely needed. And that's why on day 29, we went back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's starting to feel like it wasn't the adjustments that impacted the coffee, but rather time, as this one wasn't anywhere near as good as our initial impressions of this coffee. the majority of the intensity was lost with a much more nondescript berry tone. So this was a drastic shift, and I was beginning to wonder whether this is just the result of it being a decaf coffee. We somewhat pulled it back on day 32 as we opted for the Chemex, and interestingly, it was a fair bit better than the previous day. Coffee has felt slightly inconsistent in that sense, as it resembles more of the earlier experiences with the intense berry aspect, but also the decaf-like aspect in the cool down and finish. So that's one thing that I began to notice about this coffee, is that it can be slightly inconsistent, and I feel like maybe it was a little bit, we'll say, sensitive to the brew. Day 35, final notes that we do have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's a much better day as it's still adding to the bit of inconsistency given that this was a better day of this coffee. The berries are better defined in that slightly more dark tart sense with more of the decaf aspect in the finish yet again. But at this time, once again, we're getting that intensity back, which is something that I didn't necessarily want to lose given that the intensity came without a overly long-lasting fermentiness or heaviness in that regard. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick. And that is the finish at a level 5. So that's not atypical for Wilton Benitez coffees, but I think it's probably atypical for decaf coffees. Now here's the thing about that finish is you probably expect it to be in that slightly more funky and heavy berry sense, but that's not necessarily the case. While it's there, it's a little bit more of that lingering decaf-like aspect. I think you can definitely feel it much more in the finish, as at the forefront, there is a nice bit of intensity to the berry-like aspects of this coffee. That's why you're able to feel those in significant abundance, but as the coffee does start to cool down, you're experiencing just a long-lasting finish in that decaf-like sense. In addition to that, there is some sugariness, and I think that kind of goes together. I think that might be attributed to that decaf taste, but that's where the finish does come into play within this coffee. Handful of level 4s. We will start with the sweetness at a level 4. So this one was very, very sweet, not too surprising in any sense, as this is still a Wilton Benitez coffee and a slightly more processed Wilton Benitez coffee, and you can definitely feel it a lot more in the fruit sense. However, there is a little bit of a caramelized and a little bit of a sugary aspect to it as well. Didn't necessarily feel the need to mention that too often throughout the notes, mostly because this coffee was pretty well dominated and defined by a lot of the fruit aspects within this coffee. It is, after all, called Blackberry jam, so you can definitely see a fair bit of the berry-like aspects, especially in the darker sense, to this one. And that's why the berry fruit, unsurprisingly, is there at that level 4 mark. And while I said unsurprisingly, I guess you should still keep in mind that this is a decaf coffee, and given that the only other decaf coffee we had struggled to reach any of these higher measures within our tasting wheel, that speaks to just how intense this coffee was relative to that one, as there was plenty of the berry aspects throughout the entirety of this coffee. Bunch of level 3s. We'll actually start with the acidity level 3, and the acidity is very weird and interesting because yes, you can feel a little bit of brightness, but the brightness is very fleeting. So as you're drinking it, I said to myself, I mean, it can score at that level 4 because you have a little bit of it, but as soon as you've taken that sip, the brightness just seems to kind of disappear within the coffee. So that's one thing I kind of mentioned on that first today, was I fully expect a lot of these more processed Wilton Benitez coffees to have that very strong and intense brightness to it. This one, while it was slightly present, it just fleeted ever so quickly. Florality, level 3. And it's a little bit more of a perfumey florality, and I think that goes in line with a lot of these Colombian coffees, more processed Colombian coffees. Even then, not necessarily too descriptive in that regard, a little bit more on the darker side of things. We move on to the caramel level 3. That's something that I briefly mentioned, and I think that once again goes in line with the decaf aspect of these coffees, because that's been consistent among the 2 decaf coffees that we had that slightly more brown sugary, darker sugary aspect to the both of them, and at times a little bit more of a caramel aspect. So that's probably in line with the experience you can get with decaf coffees. Honestly, don't know. That's the only takeaway I have in comparison between the two, what was consistent between the two, mostly because these two coffees were as wildly different as possible. And then the final level 3 we're discussing is that cleanliness, because I initially thought this one is actually going to be on the cleaner side of things relative to Wilton Benitez's coffees in general. And while it was, I think that the ever so slight smoky quality that you see there may have hindered that ever so slightly. In addition to that, that long-lasting decaf-like aspect of this coffee, I think both of those two things kind of took away from what was an otherwise pretty surprisingly well-defined coffee. So that's why the cleanliness scored there at that level 3 mark, though at times I was wondering if it was actually going to be justified at a level 4. Final thing worth discussing is the body at level 2, and I will be very happy with this one having a little bit more texture than that Rainbow EA decaf, because that one just seemed to lose any sort of structure right from the start. But this one right here at least had a little bit of body to it, even then not necessarily the most amount of body. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, it's very mixed in a weird way, because I have never been the biggest fan of Wilton Benitez's coffees, mostly because they are a little bit too intense and out there for me. And this one felt like a Wilton Benitez coffee, but significantly more toned down. So I asked myself at the end of the day, which coffee would I actually prefer to do an entire bag review of? Something like this, which doesn't necessarily have that overly intense, long-lasting sweetness, brightness, and finish to it, or this one right here, which didn't have that same sort of intensity, but at the same time, it's just had that decaf-like aspect to it. And I mean, honestly, neither would be my preference, but I think I would actually still stick to the Anaerobic, the more intense version of something like this, mostly because I think that just having the more true coffee-like quality is something that appeals to me, even if it's not necessarily a coffee that I enjoy to begin with. So I don't think I would have enjoyed something that was in the same vein that wasn't decaf at all, as that's typically been my results with these sort of coffees. But this one right here, I have to say, it acted close enough to a regular coffee that I can see why people may have liked this one as their favorite decaf ever, because it's close. I mean, we were actually fortunate enough to be able to brew this with our standard recipe. So that goes to show that this coffee can actually act like a normal coffee. So massive credits to Wilton Benitez and September on the combination of this one, because that I would say is a pretty big feat, even though I still don't have too much familiarity with decaf coffees in general. One final note on that, it is still probably going to be a bit before I revisit any sort of decaf coffees in the future, because I honestly didn't enjoy this one as much either. So I think it's just safe to say decaf coffee still has a little bit of work to do, at least for me to enjoy them. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's kind of interesting. If you're looking for a much more intense decaf, then this one's an ideal fit for you, because it is very reminiscent of what you'd expect from a slightly more processed Colombian coffee, without necessarily sacrificing too many of the typical qualities that you would expect from coffee in general. You look back at that tasting wheel, and for all intents and purposes, you can mistake that for a normal coffee, because the tasting wheel looks like that of what you would experience from a normal coffee. Other than that, it does offer a very intense berry-like aspect to it, plenty of sweetness and a long-lasting finish. And if you don't mind that decaf-like taste to it, that's kind of the only takeaway that I really have that would really hinder a lot of people's feelings and impressions on this one being a decaf coffee. But even then, it's smaller than I might have expected going into it, and that's also kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Blackberry Jam, decaf washed anaerobic processed Colombia from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.